The problems government faces are serious and they're overwhelming, and there are an awful lot of them. And to a certain extent, pointing the finger of blame, which I have been doing, doesn't really change anything, because the problems still exist, and we have to help to resolve them. And actually, I honestly think that people who have the guts to stand up for public office are largely to be applauded and celebrated, because you immediately become the focus of media attention and public attention, and you can very often be subject to personal attacks. I'm not commenting on the competence of those people, but they're very courageous, in my view. It's a thankless task in many ways. I'm coming back to the same point, actually, because I just really want to emphasise this. The work that we do as charities is not about the money. Effecting real change, we contribute way more to society than just the work that we do. It's not just about cleaning up canals or sheltering the homeless or feeding the poor or caring for disenfranchised children. Fundamentally, the work that we do is about rebuilding communities. It's about encouraging people to take responsibility for their lives, for their environment and for each other. We are more than the sum of our parts, we are more than the job, and we are much more than just a deliverer of services. So I do not think it is our job to become a leaner, meaner, more rationalised, more business-like, more ruthlessly competitive voluntary sector. I think that message is a bunch of rubbish spoken by a whole load of people who have no clue about the realities of the real problems that we face on the ground. They keep telling us we've got to compete to survive. I say PAP. We have PAP. It's a good word, isn't it? Actually, that was not the word that's written down here, but I'm not sure I can use the bad words in this context. But anyway, we have to collaborate to survive, which is a totally different thing. And nor is it about focusing ever more on what we can do for government so we can get a slice of an ever-shrinking government funding pie. You know that thing, those conversations we have, particularly with our boards of trustees, when we say there isn't any money in this pot anymore, but if we set up this new project, we can get some money from that pot, when actually that new project wasn't necessarily really core to what we're there to achieve in the first place. Let me ask you something. Where's our anger? Where's our passion? Most of us do not work for charities for the money. We work for them because we're angry. We're angry about the environment, the poor, the starving, the disenfranchised, the abused. When did we lose that fire in our bellies? When did we stop saying we'll do what it takes, but we will not compromise our values and our ethics, our principles and our beliefs? I wonder if it's when we started convincing ourselves that we couldn't do it without the money. We must not take money because that's how we can keep staff. Never forget, we do not exist to employ people or to pay rent. We exist to serve our beneficiaries. And frankly, being smaller and thinner with fewer paid staff and more volunteers is just as valid a way as achieving our aims, and I would argue actually possibly more sustainable. There's a reason people volunteer for charities and not for businesses. There's a reason people donate money to charities and not businesses. It's called altruism, it's called conscience, it's called love. All of those old-fashioned words, which I think are so pertinent to today's world, that are so unfashionable to say. Because if we remind ourselves of what's needed from the viewpoint of the cause or the beneficiaries, we might think very differently about how we approach what we do and how we resource it. I mean, there are big problems, I've said that, and I do worry about modern society. And I do think that in the last couple of decades in particular, the powerful and successful move towards ensuring that our citizens know their rights and how to demand they are met has had the unintended consequence of many people in our society now thinking almost solely in terms of their rights and not in terms of their responsibilities. And I suspect if more of us focused on what our responsibilities are, to each other, to our families, to our communities, to wider society, and to our fellow human beings, rather than on what our rights are, we wouldn't keep having to emphasise the need for rights to be maintained and upheld. It doesn't surprise me, really, that society is not very happy, even allowing for media hype, and there is some exaggeration in some areas. There is no doubt that we have seen a huge increase in family breakdowns, in suicides and depressive illnesses, in disenfranchised and bitter young people. Although actually, I don't think young people get ever such a hard time. I've got to tell you, the teenagers today are much nicer than I was when I was a teenager, much more committed to the environment and things like that. I would never say that, of course, in front of any teenagers. Anyway, but do you know what happens? To solve these problems, what our citizenry has started to do is it looks to the state. It looks to the state to solve the problems. We say it is our right to live safely, healthily and happily, and it's your job, state, to provide that for us, to tackle our problems for us. It's the Prime Minister's job, it's the local authority's job, it's the local councillor's job, it's not our job. And I think that the unintended consequence of the dependency, rights-driven culture that we live in is that people have stopped trusting each other. We've got to a stage now where we have to introduce rules or legislation to get people to do the right thing. But here's the thing, even when we do that, even when we do introduce rules and laws, that cannot replace or even stimulate an individual's own personal sense of integrity. With this expenses scandal, most of our politicians have pleaded that they acted within the rules. And in fairness, actually, to most of them, indeed they have. But here's the thing. We expect the leaders in our society to be above the rules. We expect them to have a moral compass, a sense of values and morality that isn't hiding behind the rules. We expect our leaders in society, and not just our political leaders, us as well, to abide by the spirit, not just the letter of the law. And I think it's down to thinking we've got to legislate and regulate for everything, where we require the might of the law, all rules and regulations, because we don't trust our citizens to know to do what is right. And we don't realise that in a healthy society, the only interference we ought to need is to ensure that there's provision and support for those who struggle to live up to those higher ideals, often through no fault of their own. And actually, just as a slight aside, I notice that in our own organisations as well. I'm constantly either frustrated or amused when I see the plethora of rules and regulations within charities that themselves are about not trusting our own people. You know, you've got to sign a pen for a chit out of the cupboard, or you're not allowed to engage in a conversation. I would say to you, go back, take all the rules, policies, processes and procedures in your charities, tear them up and start again with the bare minimum. Okay, there are some pale shaking faces there saying, oh no, we couldn't possibly. But you know, I think, let's get back to that old-fashioned word, trust. Really, really, really. And for goodness sake, if we can't trust our own people, how on earth do we expect to trust anybody else? The other thing about relying on the state, citizens relying on the state to solve society's problems, is that we're not looking to government through engaging in our democratic process. And I think that it's actually going to get worse. I feel very, very pessimistic about the vote turnout in the general election next year, and I think that's a real pity, because our political leaders have taken such a massive battering to their integrity. I think even more of the general populace are going to say, what's the point? Someone told me that more people vote in the X Factor than vote in the general election. That's staggering, isn't it? You know, and I'm actually probably, I'm guessing Strictly. Any of you Strictly fans here? What, only one or two? What's the matter with you? It's fabulous. Although I miss Rav. I'm sorry, I do. Anyway, when you ask people why they don't vote, they say they don't think it'll make any difference. And of course, on one level, it won't make any difference. If you don't vote, it's not going to make any difference, frankly. You can't change the world that way. I personally believe that we have a responsibility to vote, that we in the voluntary sector are the last really democratic outlier in our society, and that we need to lead the way by demonstrating we need to vote ourselves as leaders in the voluntary sector, and we need to encourage others around them to vote.